to sort of see it, have a dialogue. Here's how we can do it. If they like it and they get used to it, then it often you can grow from there. If they're hearing things for the first time in the final of their mix, right before they're about to let the film go entirely, and it's all new to them, it's often scary, and they don't like, they're not sure of it. So this is an opportunity for everyone to sort of feel where the sound is going. So sixth item on the wish list would be to have the composer on early enough so that the sound designer / supervisor could work in conjunction with them. They could see what the composer's doing, and the composer could see what the sound designer's doing, so that it was all one vision as opposed to just, again, something that's a surprise at the mix. This is a rarity, but when it happens, it's often a big help to both departments. And then there just be the final things that there just be sufficient time for prepping the editing, recording Foley, and recording ADR, and all the things that have to get done. And then that you have sufficient time for the mix. This sufficient time for the mix is the only thing I would say that where the ideal and the reality are probably the closest, because in reality the mix takes as long as the mix takes, and usually you don't have to wish that you had. I mean, you often wish you had more time, but it's sort of out of the sound supervisor's hands, and you try. There's always there's always money found to finish mixing. So then the reality of going back to what one wants in an ideal world and what actually happens is that often the sound supervisor, let's go back. The location mixer often isn't brought on until the very end. They're often not consulted about where things are being shot and the sets that are being built, and how they can collaborate with the various departments to make the sound as good as it can be. And unfortunately, then they're put into a situation where they're sort of waiting and hurrying up, and then finally, throwing something as quickly as they can together in order to record as best they can in often difficult situations, especially in New York and locations where it's difficult to get quiet. It's there's so many sound elements that can't be controlled, but they're not in a position to make decisions or to think through problem solving because they're not being asked to be brought on. They're not brought on early enough. The same with the sound supervisor. Unfortunately, somebody in my position often isn't hired until they're well into the editing stage. So if there's a problem, it can't be solved before it happens. It's something that you just figure out when you have the remaining 5 weeks. I mean, the truth is that often we're hired, say 5 to 7 to 8 weeks before a mix, and at that point you're just kind of rushing to get the work done as best you can. And there hasn't been enough thought put into the whole idea of what the sound is about and where it's going, and what the director had in mind. At that point, you're just kind of hoping you can get what you need to done to make it sound professional, to make it sound like a feature film, if that's what you're doing.
Yeah, can I ask a question? Why do you think that sound, all the different sound people aren't brought on sooner? Is that like a fault of the director or the industry, or?
I think it's more the industry. I mean, I think that, if you were to ask a director, do they want the sound? I mean, honestly, there is I think that people just don't think about sound. They don't think about it at any stage until they have to. Whether that's because directors tend to be more visual people. A lot of them come out of camera, or whether there are just so many other things on their mind that that's not one of their priorities, because there's always this impression that, oh, we can fix it later, oh, we can loop it, oh, we can, that'll be fixed in the mix. There's a saying, oh, we'll fix it in the mix. So it's a combination. Producers don't want to do it because it costs them money up front. Even if it saves them money in the long run, they don't see it that way. They're often myopic in their, post-production in general is often under-budgeted because, they have so much money, they spend so much money in production, often production will go over, and it often, that contingency comes out of post-production and things, that there's a reality check. Unfortunately, there's very little crossover between production and post-production for anybody except for the director. And even the producers are often off on their next films by the time, post-production rolls around, so they're not focusing on that.
Something I noticed at film school that I don't understand also is that a lot of student directors will say, oh, we're not going to do sound for this shot. There's MOS. And I think to myself, when they do that on set, because I've also worked on sets too, you're going to spend a lot of time rebuilding that. You should just take it now, even if it's bad.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
nobody wants to deal with it.
Well, yeah, then they complain when, you need to record ADR and Foley and, spend more time that way, making something happen that could have just happened naturally.
Right.
So those are all things. The reality is that we're often rushed into our jobs at the last minute, and as Randy Tom said, you're just throwing something at a structure that already exists, and you're not really being given the chance to expand on it or to use it to its fullest potential. In terms of going back to the idea of how, as filmmakers, you can introduce sound early into your script, it's not really a question of referring to sounds that you want to hear, but using sound as a way of establishing a point of view in the film. Using it to let the film breathe, let your ears hear, and just the way you let your eyes see. So you can do so many interesting, multi-layered, complex things with sound if you just think about, where you're going to give your film a chance to expand on those things. If you have a recollection of Barton Fink, for those of you who've seen Barton Fink, there's a sequence where the wallpaper is peeling slowly off the decaying wall at that hotel. There's an example of how sound, in conjunction with the other disciplines of filmmaking, help to design a point of view. The sound there takes on a life of its own. It's its own character almost, that wall, partly because of the sound. I would say mostly because of the sound.
Do you ever, as a post-production sound editor or supervisor, do you ever read the script before you start working and note sounds that you might find?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole idea. If you can come on early enough, you read the script, you go through, and you start thinking about sound, what they'll need, how the best way to achieve it is, you could start having a conversation with yourself that then follows into a conversation with the director, when the director is able to focus on that.
Yeah. I think that's almost it seems crazy to some people that sound people are going to read the scripts, but I think that what you were saying, it gives you, it clues you in.